East Austin has had, I think, what I would call sort of an arc of a trajectory of change. And there are lots of historical reasons and motivations that are behind, sort of the result that we're seeing today. I mean, certainly when you talk about East Austin, you have to talk about the city's 1928 master plan that designated East Austin, portion of the city east of 35, north of Lady Bird Lake, and west of 183. And I'll use the verbatim term that was used, designated it as the Negro District. And that was the city's attempt to create something separate but equal. But of course, history has shown us that it was separate and anything but equal. And so African American households really shifted in a big way over into East Austin from what were dozens of smaller satellite African American communities, places like Wheatsville, Clarksville, St. John Colony. All of these places that had very tight clusters of African American communities basically shifted into East Austin. And yet the southern part of this district, sort of the East Cesar Chavez area, you mentioned Willow Street, that historically was occupied by German and Swede families and households. And only later, in the 50s, really the late 40s and the 50s, did that become to morph into what became kind of the bedrock of Austin's Hispanic community. And yet East Austin then, during the 30s, 40s, and 50s, kind of became, I mean, almost, the part of the city where we located industrial land use, where we had toxic land use. We had lots of sort of land use negatives going on, and it was, very much that we were sort of dumping those negatives onto a community that really couldn't do much about it. The Swedes and Germans ultimately moved out, and it became then really primarily a Latino community to the south and an African American community to the north. And that line historically was 7th Street, and it was relatively stark. It was a pretty hard line. And so to go back to this notion of East Austin as a whole environment, the city then, I think, really stepped up in the 70s and began to mitigate these environmental degradative land uses. For example, we closed the tank farm. It went until the early 90s until we did that. We were able to downsize and ultimately relocate a large recycling center. Crime has been dramatically reduced in East Austin. And so there have been several sort of macro level changes that have occurred that have all of a sudden created a very different type of cachet for East Austin in terms of just strictly the market attractiveness of it. And then as downtown Austin began to take off, then in sort of an interesting way, then all of a sudden, in a relative sense, East Austin real estate was very affordable from a comparative standpoint to downtown.